Have you ever heard a voice so rich and resonant it felt like it could fill every corner of your world, yet was fragile enough to make you hold your breath, afraid you'd break the moment? Phyllis Hyman's voice was that kind of voice. And while countless singers have risen and faded, few have touched the stage with the depth and vulnerability that she brought to every note. It's as if you could hear all the love, loneliness, glamour, and heartbreak of her life wrapped up in a single phrase. But hers was a story far more complicated than any chart-topping hit or Broadway spotlight. To understand why she still matters, we have to travel back through time to a city alive with the creative energy of jazz and soul, sift through the passions that shaped her, linger on the heartbreak that stalked her, and hold gently the triumphs that made her radiant, even if only briefly. She was born Phyllis Linda Hyman on July 6, 1949 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a bustling city steeped in a heritage of music and culture. Philly wasn't just any place in the late 1940s and 1950s. Jazz clubs hummed with the energy of up-and-coming performers, while soul and doo-wop groups serenaded neighborhoods on street corners. In many households, Sunday mornings meant gospel on the radio, and Saturday nights meant dancing to fresh R&B tunes at house parties. If you grew up in Philly then, you couldn't help but inhale melody in the air. It was as much a part of the fabric of life as the stoops people sat on to chat about the day. Phyllis's family was big, and so was her curiosity. Though certain details differ between recollections, many older acquaintances recall she was a tall, striking girl with a presence that made you do a double take, even before she ever sang a note. She inherited a multicultural heritage. Her father had Puerto Rican roots, and her family also identified strongly with African American traditions. Those varied influences would later seep into her artistry as she comfortably straddled the worlds of jazz, soul, and R&B without ever losing authenticity in any of them. In a sense, she was born to embrace musical diversity. It was said in family circles that little Phyllis, still a toddler, would hum tunes at home and captivate everyone with her sense of pitch. But nobody around her could have predicted how uniquely intense her journey would become. Philadelphia was in the midst of social transformation by the time Phyllis was entering her teenage years. Civil rights movements, immigration battles, and shifting cultural norms shaped the daily conversations in many Black communities. Music was a unifying force. Gospel quartets and jazz combos performed everywhere, from local churches to smoky clubs. It was not uncommon for local kids to dream of singing, performing, or just being part of the growing wave of Afrocentric creativity that was beginning to resonate on a national scale. For young Phyllis, these rhythms seemed to define her sense of self early on. She admired the great vocalists, Sarah Vaughan, Nina Simone, and Nancy Wilson among them, women whose vocal style carried both regal elegance and raw emotion. She once mentioned in a rare early interview that hearing Nancy Wilson taught her the power of phrasing, how a simple shift in tone could change an entire lyric's meaning. Growing up tall in a busy city often made her feel both noticed and overlooked. Classmates remembered her as the girl who either dominated the conversation, telling jokes and stories, being that natural performer, or occasionally stood in a corner, lost in her own thoughts. It was a duality that never really left her, even as she climbed the ladder of fame. She understood how to become larger than life in front of a microphone, but she also knew the insecurity that comes from never quite knowing where you fit. This uneasy dance of her personality would factor into her adult relationships, her career decisions, and eventually her mental health. As the 1960s transitioned into the early 1970s, Philadelphia was exploding with new sounds. Gamble and Huff were pioneering the smooth orchestral Philly soul that would sweep the nation. Local producers were searching for fresh young talents who could capture this new vibe. Phyllis, by then in her early 20s, found herself in local bands, singing covers or original compositions that friends and small-time producers brought along. She joined various groups searching for that special blend of artistry and camaraderie. For a time, she was with a band called The New Direction, showcasing her voice in smaller venues. People took notice. The hush that fell over an audience when she delivered a particularly poignant note was almost ominous. Some well-wishers thought she had a future in local clubs, maybe a record deal if she got lucky. But she had dreams that went beyond the smoky rooms of Philly. In a stroke of serendipity, she caught the attention of drummer Norman Connors, a savvy musician and producer who had a knack for discovering and nurturing untapped talent. Connors had grown up in the same Philly music scene, and when he heard Phyllis, he was enamored with her timbre and the emotional authenticity that emanated from each performance. With his encouragement, she joined him in recording sessions and eventually featured on his albums. Those early collaborations yielded the first flickers of national attention. Record executives and other established musicians began to whisper about the tall singer from Philly, who combined the soulful warmth of the city with a jazz sensibility that felt both classic and brand new. She relocated to New York City in the mid-1970s. If Philadelphia was a cradle of her musical identity, then New York was the crucible that tested her. Here, record labels towered over Midtown, and iconic performance spaces like the Apollo Theater and the Blue Note demanded more than just raw talent. They required star power. Phyllis soon discovered that to thrive in the hustle of Manhattan, you had to juggle intense creative demands with relentless business negotiations. Her open-hearted style sometimes left her unprotected in a town where deals were made and broken in the blink of an eye. Yet she also found supporters who recognized her gifts and were determined to help her chart a path. She was signed briefly to a small label, but then caught the eye of industry heavyweight Clive Davis, who ran Arista Records. Davis had an unerring ability to sense commercial potential, and while his relationship with Phyllis proved complex, he did see that her voice had something unique. With Arista, she recorded several albums that would become cornerstones of her discography. You Know How to Love Me from 1979 was a highlight, an exuberant disco-infused track that soared into the R&B charts. The production was polished, the arrangement tight, and her vocals were unstoppable, powerful but never forced, emotional without being melodramatic. The single introduced her to a broader audience, solidifying her as not just a studio vocalist, but a star with mainstream appeal. Nightclubs across America echoed with that tune, and DJs spun it into the late hours. For that moment, at least, she had arrived. But commercial success was no magic cure for her personal struggles. Behind the scenes, Phyllis battled insecurities about her direction, her image, and her ability to stand out in a field crowded with emerging stars. The late 1970s saw a wave of new R&B icons, each vying for radio play and label promotion. Phyllis, older than many up-and-comers, felt she had to fight twice as hard for marketing support. She was also navigating an industry that could be punishing toward women who wanted to maintain creative control. And even though she was heralded for her commanding presence, she was a deeply sensitive soul, prone to emotional highs and lows that sometimes took her away from the stage for short stretches. Yet the music never stopped calling her back. In the early 1980s, a new chapter opened with the Broadway production of Sophisticated Ladies, a musical revue based on the music of Duke Ellington. This was no small affair. Broadway demanded an extraordinary level of showmanship, discipline, and vocal prowess. Phyllis's role earned her a Tony Award nomination, a testament to how easily she could transition from the constraints of a recording booth to the expansive realm of theater. She got to share the stage with other phenomenal talents, dancing and singing night after night, immersed in Ellington's timeless jazz. Critics lauded her performance. She was commanding yet gracious, sassy yet elegant, her signature voice weaving Ellington's melodies into something distinctly her own. For many, seeing Phyllis in Sophisticated Ladies was a revelation, an R&B star proving she could also dazzle Broadway audiences. This moment seemed like it should have been a springboard to unstoppable mainstream fame. However, life rarely unfolds in a straight upward trajectory. Once Sophisticated Ladies ended, she found herself back in the recording studio, navigating an industry now shifting toward a more pop-oriented R&B sound. The rise of MTV and the growing importance of music videos placed added emphasis on youthfulness and crossover appeal. Phyllis had a glamorous style. She stood around 6 feet tall with elegant features and a penchant for chic hats and lavish gowns. But she wasn't a typical pop starlet. Her persona was more adult, more refined, and her voice was drenched in emotional depth that wasn't always easy to market to a mainstream crowd chasing the next catchy hook. Some inside Arista championed her as the next major soul jazz crossover star. Others worried she didn't fit neatly into the commercial formulas. Clive Davis, who had a track record of grooming mega artists, apparently wanted to shape her into something more conventionally profitable, though the details vary depending on who recounts them. Phyllis's own recollections in interviews hinted at tension with the label, feelings of being underappreciated or overshadowed when newer acts joined the roster. This sense of displacement and disappointment started to exacerbate her internal battles with depression. Friends noticed she would sometimes withdraw, ignoring calls or invitations. In public, she still commanded the stage, her comedic timing, infectious laughter, and larger-than-life attitude enchanting fans. But in private, she was wrestling with emotional lows that seemed inescapable. Some who knew her intimately recalled that she put immense pressure on herself to be perfect, to deliver the best possible performances, to be glamorous, strong, and unaffected. But behind closed doors, she felt misunderstood and lonely. Throughout the mid to late 1980s, Phyllis continued releasing music that showcased her remarkable voice. Albums like Goddess of Love, 1983, and Living All Alone, 1986, spotlighted a more mature, introspective side. The title track of Living All Alone in particular became a signature ballad, slow, haunting, and heartbreakingly honest. In many ways, it captured her innermost turmoil, the desire for love amid a pervasive sense of alienation. Though not a massive commercial smash, it spoke volumes to fans who found solace in her words. Critics praised her for her emotional candor, calling her one of the most underrated vocalists of her generation. In an industry that frequently favored younger, more pliable newcomers, Phyllis's artistry could seem too nuanced, too substantial. She was offering listeners an unfiltered window into her soul, unusual in a business that often packaged heartbreak as something tidy and polished. During this time, she also made an unforgettable cameo in Spike Lee's 1988 film School Days, performing B1. While it was a short appearance, her aura on screen was undeniable. Even in that cameo, audiences got a glimpse of her ability to convey deep emotion. Her tall frame and charismatic presence dwarfed the surroundings, turning a simple musical number into a highlight that fans of the film still remember. It was a testament to her multi-dimensional talent. She could act, sing, and captivate without overshadowing the story at hand. But personal struggles only intensified as her career advanced. She wrestled with weight fluctuation, which some producers and executives considered a marketing liability at a time when female performers were expected to embody a narrow standard of beauty. She also found herself in financial difficulties, partly due to unsteady management and the music industry's predatory practices. The burden of debts and the constant jostling for a record deal or promotional support created a vicious cycle that seemed to feed her depression. There were attempts to get therapy, to find spiritual solace, to reorganize her life, yet her own expectations remained punishingly high. In interviews from the early 1990s, she was open, though somewhat guarded, about the toll her mental health struggles were taking on her life. One rare late-night radio interview showed her speaking with unusual candor, saying she sometimes wished the world would stop long enough for her to catch her breath. She acknowledged that being in show business often felt like being trapped on a perpetually spinning carousel, glamorous from a distance but dizzying up close. She took a brief hiatus from recording in the early 1990s, re-emerging with the album Prime of My Life in 1991. To many, it felt like a triumphant moment. The lead single, Don't Want to Change the World, was more upbeat than most of her prior material, and it gave her the biggest R&B chart success of her career. The track exuded confidence, showcasing her agile vocal runs and a production that managed to sound contemporary without losing the sophistication that defined her. For a time, it appeared she was hitting a new stride, embracing an updated R&B style while maintaining her unique artistry. She garnered more media attention, earned a dedicated following among adult contemporary listeners, and performed at sold-out shows where longtime devotees cheered her on, thrilled to see her in a seemingly better headspace. But her old battle with depression was never far behind. Friends and bandmates sensed that her emotional fragility had grown more pronounced. Some nights she sparkled on stage, bantering with the audience, delivering sets that soared beyond expectations. Other nights she seemed distant, almost stoic, pushing through the performance but carrying a sadness that made her eyes glisten under the stage lights. In her dressing room, she would sometimes speak of heartbreak and exhaustion, asking rhetorical questions about why life had to be so complicated. Despite her best efforts, she struggled to find stability in her personal life. Romantically, she had relationships that flickered, but never quite stabilized. Close companions occasionally hinted that she craved the kind of unconditional love and unshakable support that isn't easy to find in show business, especially when you've been hurt before. Even her philanthropic gestures, such as fundraising events she sometimes participated in or intimate charity gigs, reflected her desire to give back to those in need, perhaps in part because she recognized suffering in all its forms. While not as publicly vocal about charity as some celebrities, she took quiet pride in using her voice to help. There are anecdotes of her gifting personal items or going out of her way to organize benefit concerts for individuals in crisis. In those moments, you could see a flicker of the young, idealistic Phyllis from Philly, a woman who felt music's highest calling was to heal and connect. Yet the pattern was tragically set. Every time she found a bit of peace, another wave of depression would crash in. By 1993 and 1994, the music industry had changed dramatically. Rap and hip-hop had surged to the forefront of mainstream culture, alongside new R&B artists who leaned heavily into hip-hop production styles. Soulful balladeers like Phyllis were less in demand, overshadowed by younger stars with a more pop-oriented or hip-hop-infused appeal. Record labels poured resources into the next big thing, often leaving older, established acts to fend for themselves. The cyclical nature of the industry left her constantly auditioning her worth, Even though she had earned respect across multiple genres, she continued to perform in jazz clubs and intimate venues. Those who attended these smaller shows described them as transcendent experiences. In these settings, freed from the constraints of commercial expectation, she dove deep into jazz improvisations, let her voice meander into soulful outbursts, and connected intimately with fans who understood her artistry. She might sing a single phrase of a classic ballad in such a way that the entire room would fall silent, as though time had paused just for her. But after the applause died down, the silence in her personal life grew heavier. In the final weeks of her life, Phyllis was preparing for a performance in New York. On June 30th, 1995, she was slated to appear at the Apollo Theater as part of a show celebrating Black music heritage. She was rehearsing, going through the motions, but friends noticed a palpable tension. She seemed more subdued than usual, and while she tried to mask her pain with jokes and half smiles, her eyes told a different story. That night, just hours before she was due on stage, she retreated to her apartment in New York City. And there, in a moment that continues to haunt those who loved and admired her, she made the irreversible choice to end her life. She left behind a note that contained the words, I'm tired, may God bless you." The tragedy reverberated through the music community. Fan hotlines, radio stations, and local newspapers lit up with the news. There was collective shock. How could someone with such a commanding presence, someone whose voice had been a lifeline for so many, feel so alone? It sparked conversations about mental health in the music industry, though these discussions were quieter in the mid-1990s than they might be today. Grief overtook those who had grown close to her, including her band members, friends, and even casual fans who had found solace in her recordings. In the aftermath, tributes poured in from fellow artists, some sharing stories of her kindness or recollections of her nurturing them backstage. One rarely mentioned anecdote came from a local musician who said that, during her last months, Phyllis had provided him with a place to stay when he was facing homelessness. These small gestures added yet another layer to her story, revealing a woman who, despite her own intense internal struggles, could still reach out to help others. But as with any complex life story, her legacy came wrapped in multiple viewpoints. Some people argue that the music industry's inflexible demands played a role in wearing her down. The unrelenting pressure to keep up with trends and maintain a youthful appearance chipped away at her sense of self. Others point out that her struggle with depression was likely multifaceted, rooted in personal histories, biological predispositions, and heartbreaks that no external success could remedy. In interviews conducted years later, some colleagues wondered why more intervention wasn't possible, or why mental health care was still such a taboo topic. Friends asked themselves if they could have done more, if they had missed warning signs beyond her occasional admissions of fatigue and sadness. Historians of R&B and soul look at Phyllis Hyman's discography as a treasure trove of underappreciated music. They point out how her mid-range power and crystal-clear top notes were nearly unrivaled. Vocal teachers sometimes use her recordings to demonstrate impeccable phrasing and breath control. Jazz aficionados highlight her interpretive skill, describing her approach as a living conversation with each melody, shaped by the moment and colored by her emotional state. She fused influences from Ella Fitzgerald, Nancy Wilson, and Billie Holiday, yet never mimicked them. Her voice was unmistakably her own. She was among the few who could transition from a soulful whisper to a full-bodied belt in a single phrase, leaving audiences mesmerized. Her story also carries lessons for the broader world. It shines a spotlight on the importance of mental health awareness, especially in industries that demand constant perfection. It reveals how success can mask profound despair and it underscores the power of empathy. A voice that so clearly expressed sorrow and vulnerability might have been crying for help in ways that weren't fully recognized. In the decades since her passing, there has been a growing willingness to address mental health among public figures. Though far from perfect, the music industry today at least pays lip service to the idea of therapy, self-care, and peer support, something that was less visible in the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s. For the older fans who witnessed her prime, Phyllis Hyman remains a cherished figure. They recall her concerts as spiritual experiences, nights when her voice soared to celestial heights. Younger generations often discover her through streaming services, charmed by the timeless quality of tracks like You Know How to Love Me, and undone by the raw emotion of Living All Alone. Online forums devoted to soul music sometimes explode with discussions on the subtle modulations of her vocal runs, or the emotional gut punch in her live recordings of certain ballads. In that sense, she lives on, bridging generational divides through the enduring power of her music. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.